with, the background that all of you have, both in, the academic science and traditional ecological knowledge, how do you see the two, working together? Because it's becoming more obvious that that's what's going to have to happen to go forward. So where do you see the opportunities? Where can we get better in working towards that?
There's a process that, if you come to the lecture tomorrow at lunchtime, after lunch, there's a process that we use, and I know you've heard it over and over again, and it's called the Two Row Wampum, and it talks about two paths. There's a metaphor again. Two paths, we're going down this river of life together. And down this river of life, we might have two different value systems, but we can be able to relate to each other. And when we do that, when you look at, what's in between us, is it conflict? Is it, a different system? Yes, but between us, there's peace, friendship, and respect. And if we keep that in mind, then we can work together. We do need the sciences, because when you look at indigenous knowledge systems, that's a system that was observed over long periods of time. We probably, knew how to live on this land because we observed the animals, we observed the trees, we observed everything here and knew how to get along with them. But sometimes with this changing world, we now need to know instantly what's happening. Why did the water turn from blue to green? Well, algae bloom. You can look at that through observation, but to get an immediate answer, you have to go sometimes to a pH test for the water or whatever else you need. So sometimes we need that instant. And we're developing a Haudenosaunee environmental protection process that does bring the two together. And I will talk about that tomorrow, but maybe Robin or Jeanne wants to add.
I would want to echo what you're saying about science, and it's the way that it has divorced itself from spirituality. Science almost is by definition looking at things from the material world, which are testable, looking for processes. But to me, the beauty of native science, of traditional ecological knowledge, is that it is embedded in a sense of moral responsibility. It's embedded with a sense of reciprocity, so that we can understand the material functionings of the world without separating it from our responsibilities to the world. And I think the metaphor of the two row wampum is really important. And as I've tried to think about traditional knowledge and scientific knowledge coexisting, the metaphor that I use to try to think about it is that of the three sisters. Of when we think about why does a three sisters garden work so beautifully as it does, how does it nourish so well? It's because the strengths of each of those plants come together. The strengths of one plant complement the weaknesses and substitute of the weaknesses for the other. And in the scientific community, we understand what the weaknesses of our science is, and particularly the application of that science to these complex issues. And so it seems to me that the wisdom of traditional knowledge sort of intertwining with scientific knowledge, really guiding scientific knowledge, the three sisters could provide a model for a symbiosis between those ways of knowing.
Not being a scientist, I'm just a regular, ordinary, whatever you call it, not a scientist. But I have to say that my comment would be that yes, science and traditional knowledge can meet and work together. But I would have to say that it is almost a forced thing because of this world that's around us now, because people are accustomed to questioning everything and expecting immediate answers, as opposed to believing in the following the beliefs and the teachings of our people whose ways have been that way through ages and ages. We don't even know how long. I think that's more of a proven test to me than anything. And also our faith in who we are, because if we know that the people that came before us followed these practices, they must certainly have known why at some time, and it's certainly good enough for me. I'm not doubting the science part, but I just wanted to let you know that there's also the acknowledgement part, and sometimes the expectations of the scientific side will try to overcome the traditional beliefs, which I guess are probably more of acknowledgements, patience, respect, which I'll take a little bit more time than a litmus test.
One of the things in our Thanksgiving address was we acknowledged the stars, we thanked them. And we also thanked them for bringing the water for the morning dew. And I guess, that's oral tradition, and science has just proven that water came from, I forget what star out in space. So it's real funny that, our knowledge is now being proven through the sciences. It's amazing.
Everything was integrated, and now everything has been bisected with miles and miles and miles of concrete and similar type of structures, and I'm wondering if anybody could speak to that. I don't know if that's a scientific or a traditional problem or a legal problem.
Because of not only concrete, but urbanization, et cetera, the land that was once whole is now fragmented. And that is understood as a major problem in conservation biology, in that the animals and the plants that are left on little islands, little fragments of habitat, can't move as they used to replenish each other, to breed with one another. When the world changes, as it always is, there's no place for them to go. There are no corridors by which they can escape and find the better habitat. It's of great concern with things like global climate change. As the climate changes, how will all of our relations, our non-human persons, how will they find a new place to be because of the very problem that you're talking about? And is that a problem of, I think you said, is that a problem of science or of traditional knowledge?
Or of law.
or of law, probably all of the above. But if we condition the way that we live here by respect and acknowledgement for all those other species, we wouldn't do those things. Or we then envision a future where we correct those wrongs that we've made and make places for all those species to go.
I have pests in my garden. And I'm just curious that you didn't give information about the past practices in regard to management of the land in regard to that kind of issue. I'm curious if you have knowledge of that. And the other question is mainly for Robin, I think. In regard to this project of trying to pursue the two paths, I think it's similar to what the Chinese call walking on two legs, where it's not a choice between science and indigenous knowledge, but it's a use of both. I wondered if you could speak to what your experiences have been of trying to enact that in a Western-dominated space, like ESF. And Jack might be able to speak to this too. I mean, in these institutions that some of us work in, like SU, like ESF, in which the rules of the game, the accreditation, the curriculum, all of this stuff is sort of set up in a way that doesn't validate traditional knowledge and doesn't validate traditional knowers without degrees. What has been your experience in trying to alter that and in trying to walk on the two legs? And do you feel like things are getting better in that regard?
Let me try the hardest question first, which is the second one, I think. In terms of, you're absolutely right about trying to think about traditional knowledge in the institutions of academia and even broader in scientific institutions is really swimming upstream. But I think about myself as a college student coming from a background where I thought I knew something about traditional, or I thought I knew something about plants. I thought I knew something about land just from my family, from growing up. And I went to ESF, actually, as an undergraduate. And I thought I was going to learn about plants and their relationships. I thought I was going to learn about practices of reciprocity. That's how I understood botany, as plants as persons, as non-human persons. And then when I went to college, it was a real rude wake-up call that, in fact, we were learning all the mechanisms, we were learning all the functions. There was no spirit or relationship in that at all. It was just learning the mechanisms. And I almost left college because of that, because there was no place for traditional thinking there. It was such a sharp gulf between traditional ways of conceiving of the natural world and the scientific world. And so I have to say that propels me to try to swim upstream in academia and bring this in so that these ideas that, as you say, that people have developed over millennia that are tried and true, they need to have a voice at the table. And it's starting to happen, certainly here and elsewhere around the country.
There's one prophecy also, full of prophecies today, that one of these days our children will talk to the world. And the way we interpret that is that there's going to be a lot of environmental destruction, and we see it already. And the processes that we have had through, as Haudenosaunee people, working with the land and that relationship, that one of these days, the world is going to need it. And in the future, maybe it's coming, maybe it's going to be my children, or maybe it's going to be my grandchildren. They will have this knowledge and be able to work with the outside world and teach them how to get back along with the species, with the plant life, with the fish, with the waters. And so as a parent, I raise my children traditional. I've sent one to become a Mohawk speaker, and she will know the intricate understanding of that species, because when you talk about that species, in Mohawk, you're talking about the function of it. So hopefully that knowledge is going to be passed along, and that we can preserve it and preserve that sacredness, so that when the world is ready, we'll have the knowledge holders to help with the environmental destruction that is being prophesied in the future. Just one thing about pest management, crows love corn. So when you grow your garden, you make sure that there's enough for the people now, enough for the future storage, and enough for the crows. Yeah. What else can I say?
I was recently reading, actually, some accounts of Green Revolution scientists working with Mayan farmers, and they were asking them, what are your pest problems? And there was a great deal of puzzlement about this. They said, well, what are pests? And they had to have it all explained that they were pests. They said, well, no, we don't have anything like that. And indeed, when you create a mosaic landscape where there's a great deal of diversity, when you have polycultures of all these different species, there really isn't the pest load that we're accustomed to seeing here. It's because we've so simplified our landscape and we've lost so many pieces that we focus more on trying to grow crops for profit at the great scale as opposed to growing crops for sustaining our families, that pests become a problem at that scale.
You've said a lot tonight about how science is often in contrary to traditional knowledge, but up until maybe a few hundred years ago, even in Western civilization, science was an exploration of God's work and of natural processes, natural philosophy. I was just wondering how you thought that this separation occurred and how we could bring the two back together.
I think that it's probably important to separate science as a way of knowing from science as an institution. At the beginning, Jack was talking about science as motivated by mystery, by trying to look into the living world and its complexities and understand it. Science as curiosity, science as a pursuit of knowledge is one way of thinking it, but what has happened, I think, and if you ask where did that separation come from, I think it's when science became an institution that quite honestly was hooked to capitalism, that was hooked to technology, that it was no longer a way of knowing and a way of inquiring about the mysteries of the world, but that it was harnessed to different social systems. And to me, that's where the change came.
I've been trying to understand something about the lake for the last 23 years that I've lived here. So I've read the periodic reports and kind of noticed the millions and millions of dollars of study. So your comments in the last couple of days about the pact have been the ones that have been the most interesting. So in some ways, I'd like to think that $1 billion would buy us steps towards progress. But there's some parts of what I'm reading that makes me think that what we're buying is steps backwards. And some of your comments and the nation's lawyers' comments make me think that we are buying steps backwards. And that's the part that gets me the most concerned. And the fact that the nation does not have enough of a voice in this process that's so important to a body of water that we should all care a lot about, especially since this is something that we've been focusing on for 20 years and spending millions and millions of dollars studying to come up with a solution that should take us forward. So I don't really know what should happen, but it seems like you should have more say in this. And if 90% of this land is publicly owned and they're not making any progress on your lands right action, for a start, should we just be arguing that the nation should get 51% of that 90% owned by the state, because they've taken so many millions of acres anyway, so let's talk about that 51% and let you have your voice at the table that way, and while they figure out what they're going to do about the land right action. Would that be something that would be too pushy from a Westerner's perspective, and the nation prefers a more thoughtful, legal, slow motion approach? Because I don't know how you're going to get your voice, and we're not going to put sand on top of a bunch of polluted stuff that we're then going to vacuum after they spend $1 billion.
Well, that's why we've been constantly trying to make more people aware, because hopefully you people, the citizens, can help us to make a difference and have our voice heard. And also that you people, the citizens, don't get the whole truth at any time, you know, because the stuff they put in the paper, like, oh, we're going to start the cleanup now, you know, and it's only not even a halfway thing, you know. If you had a, you know, they're talking